So, yes, coming back to your question, my father actually told me when I was 9 I started writing stuff. He said, do you realize what you're doing? You are starting off on a life of misery. If you're any good at it, you're going to be anguished, thinking about things and wanting to explain things and finding the right word and the right phrase and so on. If you're no good at it, you're going to be anguished because you're no good at it. So he said, think very carefully before you get into it.
Yeah, Chandran was your father. Did he spend his life in India? I mean, was he in Singapore?
He came to Singapore in 1947. He was born in 1914. So that makes him what, about 34 when he came.
But then he spent his time in Singapore or in Kerala? Or in Singapore?
He lived all of his life after that in vice versa.
But his story came out in Kerala.
Yes, but his stories were set. The stories were set here and in Kerala, written in Malayalam, published in Kerala by the Writers Cooperative, which was the most prestigious publishing house in Kerala. Still is.
Is there a further point to your question?
No, it's just a point of clarification.
Yeah. Waihan, you want to ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just wondering your background, family background in Kerala. How much does it impinge on your consciousness as you observe the world, as you write?
Well, quite a bit, because I've talked about the writing background. If you talk about the political background, my father was a campaign manager for David Marshall. He was a member of the Labour Front. He then was campaigning for Lim Yew Hock when Lim Yew Hock became Chief Minister of Singapore. But he quit the Labour Front because he said, I cannot be party to a corrupt party. But in the years when he was active politically, he used to have people over to the house, to the little apartment, and they would hold political meetings, and discussions. And so very early on I got to hear these things, to understand these things, to sort of sift out the public consumption from the private discussions. And so in a sense, up to 59, I had this sort of understanding from my father's point of view. But after 59, I think I sort of branched off on my own and made up my own mind about things. But I was quite interested in politics and involved in it in an intellectual sense, but not in a participative sense.
Yeah, Morris.
I'll pick up on the point you said that the future is great. Yeah, I agree with you. I get exposed to writer wannabes, aspiring writers, week in, week out, right? And I think I've cited this example. Much as most of Singaporean kids, now they are young adults, I have no literary background as such. So they come and I get young ladies come up to me and say, I've now, by the time I'm now in my early 30s, I've established myself in my career. Now I really want to get the book out in 3 months' time. So I said, well, you have no literary background. You spend all your time doing your career or business, and you're not successful, and you want to get a book out. Great, we'll do a book. Yeah, we'll do a pornographic book, you and I. And she says, I'll think about it. So it's great. The future is great. Okay.
Well, Maurice, it's not just about getting a book out. It's about getting something that's worthwhile. Anybody can get a book out. You can put words on paper, go to a publisher, and some people pay their publisher to get a book out. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about writing that means something, that people find something in. I mean, if you don't have an audience, if you don't have that sort of impact on people, then you are fooled.
And there are software programs, where you just put in 10,000 words randomly. The program will make it into a story or a poem, whatever you want. Hey, yeah.
Yeah, my question is, there seems to be a suggestion that a poet is a visionary, and in particular a political visionary. So I was wondering, what do you think is the difference between a poet who is invested in politics and a political commentator who writes for a newspaper?
I think a poet uses his own sensibilities, filters it through his own understanding, and comes out with what he feels about things. A columnist basically takes the facts, looks at it, whether you want to put one slant or the other on it, and writes a piece meant to influence an audience. I think a writer basically has got to invest a lot more of himself.
So who's a better reflection of society and changes? The reporter?
I will tell you, if you look back on history, do we remember the reporters? We remember the writers. Good or bad, we remember the writers who made an impact. We remember the historians, because you need to read history to understand where you come from, and perhaps where you're going to. We need the writers because they give us another viewpoint, but I don't think we read the columns.
Although you may say so, in more recent times, you get certain personalities, people like Tom Friedman, who are columnists, but they turn themselves into writers, right? And they come up with books that become very popular. They are remembered. They are.
Some of them not very good.
I think it's a general point, but I'm saying that.
Okay, I run one name by here. I published it. Many of you probably won't know that I was actually a publisher in Singapore as well, and that I started Times Books International, for example. When I published him, his books sold very well. And they were quite relevant at that point. But do you remember Alex Josie, for example? Yes. You see, that then we succeeded when we published him, because if you read Alex Josie still, you will get a flavor of what was being discussed at that time. And maybe his views may be personal to him, but they were also views that reflected what society was thinking about. So in that sense, Alex was perhaps a writer, more than just a columnist. So sometimes you can cross over from one to the other, perhaps. But I republished a book called Singapore Accent in the 70s, which was successful when it was published, and is still remembered in some places.
Can I ask you a question, Chandran? From the Musings, right? The general sense I get is that you see a diminishment rather than an enlargement of the Singaporean personality. The tone is slightly almost sarcastic, but there is a lot of irony and all that. So, in a fundamental sense, do you think that in spite of us being so rich and so fabulously modern, even the buildings and all the iconic structures we have, that in a real sense, the young person today leads a poorer life, in the larger sense of life than you and I did?
I think so. Not in a materialistic way, not in a material way, but in an intellectual and spiritual way. I think we lead very much less fulfilling life. And maybe that's the way society is, because Western society is not very much better off.
Well, it's interesting, because the forum from which I've just come had a different twist on it, right? That those of us who sort of made it now have maids in charge of our children. And was it Mr. Lee Kuan Yew who once said that if you're a parent that looks after your child, then your child develops and gets your DNA actively manifested. But if you leave your child with a maid, then it's your mate's DNA that the child, manifests. And so, I mean, the forum that I've just come from, ironically was saying that in a larger and funny sense of the word, we've actually made it, but our children are all like,
brought up by me.
absolutely. And therefore their sensibility, their outlook, their capacity to think, argue, articulate, is all been compromised, and all they're interested in is getting the A's for their worksheets.
Well,
Very interesting. We know writers who talk about that.
I'm one of the few people who have actually worked in China, worked with China. And I worked with them in the mid-80s when they were moving from Russian as a second language into English as a second language. But they didn't want English language textbooks. They wanted English language textbooks with Chinese sensibilities.
Dear readers,
So
the
they
library will be
had a,
closing in 30
group
minutes.
in the
If
Ministry
you
of
wish to borrow
Education,
library
chaired by the Vice
materials,
Minister of
we advise you to do so now
And
at
we
our
had
self-check machines.
foreign
We thank you for your
experts, of
visit
which
and hope
UNESCO
to see
was
you
one.
again
I
soon.
worked for UNESCO. So, but my Japanese colleague from education who was in charge of the curriculum and so on and so forth was in total agreement with the lady from the Ministry of Education in Beijing, because that lady had gone to America and was American educated, so there was a sort of wavelength that worked. But that lady had to filter it through to the Vice Minister, who was a total political person. We ran into problems, surprisingly enough, when it came down to the size of the textbook. The size of a Chinese textbook then was about half of this. Very small. And the print was, the characters were all squeezed to take up as much as possible on the page. And this was textbooks meant for middle school, which meant 12, 13 onwards. And my colleague in Paris said to me, I don't think this is educationally sound. But you are an expert in book production, book development and so on. You're going there to give a course. Can you make a side trip to see the education people and meet with them and try and convince them that we need to do a different thing with the layout and design of this books? So I went for the meeting. And we were all hoping that the Vice Minister wouldn't turn up. But he did. And when they sat down, and I gave it to them straight. I said, educationists have very clearly stated that textbooks have got to be of a certain size. That teaching material, if they are not appropriate, or worse than not having any, because they impair, they impede learning and they impair understanding. And this man got very angry, the Vice Minister. He banged the table and he said, this is we who decide what the size should be. We can't afford to have bigger textbooks because then you need more paper, and more paper means more money, and we cannot afford to spend that sort of money. And he walked out of the room, which is considered very rude and very damning, because if his staff had followed him out, then the whole project was at end. But his staff didn't. But then they threw the ball back at me and said, okay, what size would you recommend? What typeface and so on. So we sat down and worked it out. And then they said, if we wanted to do the books in this size, how much more would it cost? Luckily for me, I was able to do the calculations for that as well. And it came out that to do the sample print run that they wanted in order to test it in the classroom, we would need another $100,000 more. And they said, we will never get that money from the ministry budget. It has to come from you. If you can find us that money, then we are good. We will make sure that we convince this man and that we test the materials in this format. I was at my wit's end because I knew that there was no way that headquarters in Paris was going to give me $100,000. Our project size that we could actually finance was $30,000. And $100,000 was 3 projects that would have to go in order to be put for this. And they wouldn't do it. So, but I went down to the UNDP in Beijing. Unfortunately, the head of the UNDP was somebody I had worked with when I was in Pakistan. I knew him, so I sat down and I said, David, I need $100,000. He said, why? So I explained it to him. And I got $100,000. And I can tell you, after that, there was nothing that I could ask the Chinese government that they would do. Because we did the books as we wanted. They tested it. And you know, I asked them, what is your test sample? And they said 33 million. It was just a test sample. Because they said everybody won't be able to afford. But the problem was the moment they put it out, every parent wanted it for their children. But why is this important? Because if they hadn't switched to English then, I don't think China would have become the economic powerhouse doing work for the whole world now. Because they have a population that can take instructions from the West, understand it, and work with it. You can read the manuals for the machinery that they import and then they copy.
Thanks, Sun. Any last final observation? Dongguan? Yeah, Dongguan.
Come back to your point while you're reading. The underlying theme of your narrative is one of disillusionment, cynicism of the present, with the light of your nostalgia for the past. What is the relevance of that for some of our younger audiences here? Why should we be imposing that to them? I mean, here, they have to find their own story in the sense that for you, it's a very romantic, pre-59 era, then the tragedy of Malaysia, and then the irony of post-independence 65. We shouldn't have succeeded, but we did. And so after the irony and the satire in literary tropes, what comes? Farce. And for them, so what? They have to find their own tropes. What is the story?
Dongguan, we can have different opinions. And I think discussion is good. But at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, where are we going? Why are we going there? I think that's a rational question.
Yeah, we should be asking, and ultimately we will be thinking in terms of these literary tropes. And so why must it be the farce that comes after the satire and the comic?
Basically, I think one's reactions to certain things are based on what you grew up with, what you felt, what you lived through, why you lived through it. And in a sense, there are many of us, I suppose, who feel that what we have today, while it's fantastic in terms of achievement, materialistic achievement, it's not quite where we wanted to be in terms of spiritual and other achievement. And we have to ask ourselves why. And what are you going to leave for the next generation?
They will decide what to take from your memories.
Sorry, this
I think very, yeah.
Okay, first I like to renew my ties with Chandran, who I've not met for more than 30 years. I came just in time to hear you say that you do not like to write about things like the Malayan. But I'm happy to say that you have not refrained from commenting on social and political issues. And to some extent, your career and mine, there's some parallel in the sense that after graduation, you worked for some time in Singapore and then went abroad. You went to Karachi and Paris. I went to Kuala Lumpur as a reporter and stayed there for 15 years. And then I decided, yes, I decided to come back in 1997. At that time, it was a very different Singapore. In Singapore, at that time, was like the Singapore now. I don't think I will have come back. But anyway, not all the developments since then have been negative. there are one or two positive developments. And that nowadays there is more scope for individual expression, much more scope, and also with the development of the new media and so on. So my question to you is about the role of the new media. To what extent does it promote have to promote the creative scene in Singapore, and also that now do you agree that there is more scope for writers now to take a more active role in the social and political process of Singapore than say it was in 20 years ago?
Well, I mean, as I said, I think that there's a lot more support in material terms for writers now. But whether this is incumbent upon certain guidelines and OB, I don't know. This I don't know, because I'm no longer involved in it on a day-to-day basis. And I mean, there are other poets here, other writers here who may want to comment.